Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program is a conversation with Dr. Samuel Totten, Professor Emeritus of Education from the University of Arkansas. In this episode, Sam Totten discusses the origins of his interest in human rights and human rights education, the development of his work in genocide studies, debates regarding the definition of genocide, and his activism in providing aid to populations threatened with annihilation in Africa. So I'm so happy to be talking with a longtime colleague and friend, Sam Totten, who has worked for many years in human rights and genocide studies. How are you today, Sam?
Great, Bill. How are you?
Good. So I've known you for many years, but it's interesting for every time we speak to someone on this podcast to learn about how they first became interested in human rights issues. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Actually, I became first interested and concerned about human rights issues after I graduated from college. And I had moved up to San Francisco to work on a novel after I graduated. And every evening I used to go into Ferlinghetti's City Lights bookshop in North Beach. And I usually had the same table where I would sit every evening and read. And one evening I came in and there was a journal on the desk where I usually sat. And I believe it was a red cover, and then in black letters it said "Torture in Chile." And it was an article by a person named Rose Styron, who was a great advocate of the protection of human rights. And I read that article and I was flabbergasted. And I was flabbergasted for a couple of reasons. One, I was very disturbed that this is the first time that I could remember hearing about or learning about, reading about such human rights violations. And the human rights violations were ghastly. I questioned myself because I had been a regular reader of newspapers since I was probably in about the fourth grade. And to think that I had somehow missed that in all of those years really was very disconcerting. And the fact that I hadn't learned about human rights violations in high school, whether it was U.S. government or social studies classes, U.S. history, whatever. And I was also disconcerted that I hadn't learned about it in college. So something had happened that just where I was totally removed from this whole world that was going on and has been going on for centuries. And fortunately, at the very end of the article, Rose Styron mentioned Amnesty International. She was a member of Amnesty. She was very involved in Amnesty at the time. And it's the first time I had heard about Amnesty International. So the very next day, I went to the Amnesty office in San Francisco and told them I wanted to volunteer. And what they suggested that I do was basically serve as a Xeroxer, stapler, things of that nature. And that kind of put me off because I was geared up to work on these human rights issues. Now, I realize in retrospect, one has to start someplace. And by working in an atmosphere like that, you're going to begin to learn about human rights, all sorts of issues, and probably work your way up if you're really dedicated. So unfortunately, I said, well, thanks, but no thanks. And I ended up moving to Australia about maybe a year and a half, 2 years later. And I regularly read a newspaper called The Age, which was a newspaper that came out of Melbourne. And one day I was reading, I came across an article about a woman who was the director of the Amnesty office, and she was based in Melbourne. And I read that thing, and I thought, I need to get a hold of her. Long story short, I met her. We really hit it off. I told her that I wanted to start a adoption group in what in Australia was referred to as a rural town. And she gave me the support to do that. And so I, along with a number of colleagues, I was teaching at the time at an Australian school, got together and we formed an organization. And it was a very active organization. We had 3 prisoners of conscience that we worked on behalf of. And I'm proud to say that organization, that adoption group, is still going to this very day. And it's very active as well. But basically, those are the seeds of my interest and concern.
So how did you make the transition to then human rights education, which of course is a subset of human rights work, but also connected to teaching young people and adults?
Right. Well, of course, I had been interested in this now for about 2 years. That is human rights violations, protection of international human rights. And I had it, well, actually, in one way it was fortunate, in one way it was unfortunate. This school, for some reason, did not have an English curriculum, a social studies curriculum. I mean, nothing. And they would tell you, the administrators would tell you to go into the book room, find books that you thought might be applicable to what you were teaching, and bring them in and teach it that way. So, it was very loosey-goosey and disconcerting again for a first-year teacher. But I thought, well, this is the perfect opportunity to bring in issues around human rights. And I thought, well, the students would find these topics interesting. I assumed that a lot of them, if not most, had never heard about such things. Involved reading, involved writing, thinking, debate, speaking. So it was perfect. And so really from that point forward, that first year of teaching, and I taught for 2 years in Australia. Then I went back to California and taught, went to American School in Israel and taught, went to the U.S. House of Representatives Page School and taught. Every single place I went, I incorporated one way or another, whether it was part and parcel of a curriculum or part and parcel of incorporating writing into the curriculum, speaking into the curriculum, obviously reading into the curriculum. I infused human rights issues. And so, yeah, that became the mainstay of what I was doing.
So if we then look at the sort of trajectory of your professional career, one of the things that happens in the late 80s, early 90s is that the development of human rights education as sort of a subfield of inquiry. And you played an important role through your work in publishing and conferences, and also with the United States Holocaust Museum. Can you talk about those aspects of what you've done?
Sure. Once I got back to the United States, I was fired up to do human rights education work. I wanted to dedicate my life to that. And so I contacted Amnesty International, the New York office. And I had an idea about working with Amnesty and developing school programs across the United States. And I had various suggestions. One was to establish adoption groups in schools, study groups, books, reading groups. And I think Amnesty, they were somewhat intrigued with that, but didn't know where to take it, how to fund it, any of that. And what I had suggested was that I would take off a year or two of teaching and do this full time and travel around the country. So that did not happen. But I thought, okay, I need to do something. I need to do something to raise this issue with teachers and students. So one of the first things that I did was put together a special issue of Social Education, the Journal for the National Council for the Social Studies. And it was a special issue on international human rights. And that was published in September 1985. And it included articles on, what are human rights? There was a piece on apartheid. There were pieces on torture. There were teaching units. It was a very packed special issue. And that was really the beginning of my effort to begin to publish about international human rights. And as time went on, I mean, I published pieces in Educational Leadership, the journal under the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development. I published stuff in the Arizona English Bulletin, the New York Social Studies Bulletin, all over the place. And also, it just so happened about 3 or 4 years, about 3 years after the special issue of Social Education, I decided to write for students, generally junior high and high school students, a book on human rights. In fact, it was called Human Rights, and that was published by Enslow Publishers. And I co-authored that with a professor named Milton Clegg. So from that point forward, I was really geared up to doing anything I possibly could to address human rights education in the classroom. And I think one of the first talks I gave was at a meeting, a National Council for the Social Studies meeting in Dallas, Texas, where we met one another. And Bill Parsons was there, Steve Feinberg, and as you may recall, we all went out to dinner after that. But the session was on international human rights, and I thought it was pretty dynamic. I thought actually Parsons' talk was outstanding. I learned a lot from just observing how he went about doing that talk. But that brought me into writing about international human rights and talking about international human rights. And then, as you know, we, the two of us, along with Steve Feinberg, Grace Caparino from New York State, were asked to join an effort for the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council, which was the predecessor to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I believe we started in 89, went through 93 or something like that. And we all ended up working on different projects, as you'll recall. And the one that I was asked to work on was something called Guidelines for Teaching About the Holocaust. And I worked on that with Bill Parsons very closely, and Sybil Milton, who was at the time the museum, the council's historian. We worked on that for one entire summer. I worked on it every single day. And I believe that we also sent out different pieces of it to yourself and to others to comment, to critique. And ultimately, those guidelines were published in 1993. From there, I went on to work in the field of genocide studies, which is another whole issue. But basically, that was a genesis. All of that was the genesis of my involvement in human rights education, and genocide studies.
Yeah, well, I can say without any doubt that social education issue is what got me involved in developing an Amnesty chapter at my former place of employment.
And that is fantastic to hear. And I know that that you had that project at your school, which was absolutely wonderful. And that's exactly what I had wanted to do across the United States. So I'm very pleased about that. And I have been for a long time. Yeah, that was great stuff on your part.
Well, the interesting issue about it is I think at that period of time, there were certain things coinciding. Amnesty put on that worldwide tour where they distributed the Universal Declaration all throughout the world. They made a film that could be seen by people. They didn't have to understand the language, they could just see the cartoons. And there was a huge amount of connection between that and the fall of communism in Europe. I mean, this
Hmm.
was all happening at that time, right? The fall of the Soviet Union,
Yeah.
all that. So it was really sort of a propitious time. And then, as you mentioned, the museum coming into being
Yeah.
becomes a very significant issue because it's become a landmark institution.
It has, without a doubt. And what's really interesting, I think, about the museum, in one respect, when we were working with the museum personnel, the museum was largely focused, and understandably, uh, on Holocaust history, teaching about the Holocaust. But in subsequent years, it has become very, very active in the field of genocide studies as well, issuing early warning notices, putting books out about genocide, working on genocide education. So yeah, it's been great to see the evolution of the museum, and they're doing some terrific work and have, well, since '93.
So if I turn to your work in genocide studies, since you have been involved in it for, I'm going back now over 30 years,
Right.
um, what are some of the changes you've seen in that field, given that it's relatively young as a field of inquiry? It's not the same as, for example, European history or African history. This is something that really emerged, I think, only after the Second World War.
Yeah, that's right. So you mean similarities you're saying?
Well, yeah, I would say it doesn't have to be similarities, but what have you seen? What's been the sort of trajectory of that field?
Okay, well, yeah, I began working in the field in '83. And it was serendipitous, really, because a friend of mine who I had met when I was working in Israel at the American School, his name is Israel Sharney, who's noted as a pioneer of genocide studies. He asked me to contribute a chapter to a book that he was doing on genocide. And the piece was so long that it ended up becoming three distinct chapters in his book. I didn't realize at the time, because I wasn't at the university yet, what a boon that was for a writer. I'm going, when I got to the university, I'm going, whoa, I had three chapters in a book. And these people were very impressed with that at the university. But in the early years, the field was primarily concerned about three things. One, uh, theory of genocide, theoretical concerns, uh, the various cases of genocide, primarily focused on the 20th century, going all the way back to the Herreros in 1904, who suffered a genocide at the hands of Germany in Africa. And it was also concerned about, actually obsessed with, the definition of genocide. Now, as you know, there's a definition of genocide in the UN Convention on Genocide Prevention and the Punishment of Genocide. And it's the definition that's used when a case comes to a court, whether it's the International Criminal Court or previously the two tribunals, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda or the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. That the definition that is used. There were a good number of scholars who were not pleased with the definition. Most of them felt that it was too compressed, and what I mean by that is it limited what was considered genocide, particularly against which groups. For example, in the Genocide Convention protects these particular groups, ethnic groups, um, And what these genocide scholars were concerned about is it did not include political groups. And that was disconcerting to them and myself as well, because so many of these genocides had been perpetrated because of political issues. And so to leave that out as a protected group was really disturbing. There were other individuals who talked about the need to include social groups, and even later, gender groups. So what happened for about 15 years is that it seemed like one person after another would come up with their own definition. And they would push that definition, and they would use that definition when they went to write about some act of genocide. It became very confusing to a lot of people. And what I found was that people outside the field didn't necessarily read about these different definitions, let alone the definition in the UN Convention on Genocide. And a lot of people continued to assume that any mass killing was genocide, which is not the case. Anyways, that went on and on. Now, in the 2000s, the field began to grow a lot. New people came in to the field. New ideas were coming into the field. And so one of the changes that I've seen is that, for example, early on, you saw a lot of papers, books about bystanders, about the victim groups, about collaborators, even about rescuers. In the field of genocide studies, you didn't find that many articles, refereed or otherwise, book chapters or books on perpetrators. And since the early 2000s, that has become a huge issue. So there's been a big focus on that. There's also been a push for individuals to get out into the different nations that have experienced the genocide and to study the issues, in a particular place, to go through their archives, to speak to individual survivors if they're still alive, so on and so forth. But in 1983, there was no international association. There is now the International Association for Genocide Scholars. In 83, there were no journals focused specifically on genocide. Today, there are 3. There was very little discussions amongst a large group of people, and now there are blogs specifically tied to the International Association of Genocide Scholars. So it's really opened up and brought people together in many different ways and have pretty much solidified the field. So all of those things have been great to see. Also in the 90s, 2000s through today, there's a heck of a lot of focus on the issues of intervention and prevention. And I think part and parcel of that is because, in 94, the world experienced the genocide in Rwanda. In 95, experienced the genocide in Srebrenica. And then the early years of the 2000s, the genocide in Darfur. And then we hit 2014, and we have 4 more genocides that pop up. It's absolutely astonishing. So you had the ISIS genocide of the Yazidis in northern Iraq. There was Myanmar's genocide of the Rohingya in about 2016. There was the genocide of the Uyghurs in China. And so there's been a constant focus. What do we do aside from learning about the cases, the causes, the antecedents, the actors involved. There's been a real focus, like I said, on prevention and intervention. Unfortunately, there's not been a lot of movement on moving beyond talking about prevention and intervention. And that's where we're at today. And I think that's probably the biggest disappointment I've seen in the field.
Well, that's a perfect lead into the next question, which I think is a very significant topic, because you are sort of an exemplar of a scholar who has actually made activism a central role in your work. And so I'd like you to talk about how you envisioned yourself as an activist as well as a scholar, such as when you work in Darfur and in Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, I have to say it was actually thanks to Jerry Fowler at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. In 2004, the USAID and State Department were putting together a team, what they called investigators, to go into Darfur and to interview survivors. And Jerry Fowler, who had a great respect for and a good relationship with, recommended me and then a person named Eric Markison to join this team. So during the summer of 2004, 25 investigators were sent to Chad. The State Department had decided that it couldn't really send in this team to Darfur. It was just too dangerous. They were afraid that people would get killed, and that would be the end of the project, and they'd have a lot of problems on their hands. So what we did is we were spread out all along the border, and we all went to a different refugee camp and interviewed refugees from Darfur. And before I left for that trip, that project, my wife Kathleen said, "This is going to change you in ways that we can't even understand. This is going to change your life." She was absolutely right on target, because I became so caught up in meeting the survivors, speaking to them for hours, asking them questions, getting their answers, meeting them informally, that once that project was over, I decided to continue doing the interviews, but in different refugee camps along the Chad-Darfur border. And I believe I made 3 additional trips to Chad on my own, and did that. During that time, I ended up getting a Fulbright fellowship to Rwanda, and part and parcel of that Fulbright was to interview survivors of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, plus work on a master's degree in genocide studies for the National University of Rwanda. We can talk about that in a bit, but my point was, when I was in Africa, Rwanda, I was contacted by the University of Chicago and asked if I could give a talk on Darfur. And so I flew from Kigali to Chicago and gave that talk. And there were a number of interesting people on this panel. Well, actually, there were 3 of us on the particular panel. Juan Mendez and David Sheffer, who is a professor of political science at Northwestern. We all spoke on different aspects of Darfur. But as I was flying over, I was sitting in a middle seat on the plane, and we arrived, I think it was Nairobi at midnight or something, and a bunch of people got on, and some people sat down next to me. And I always work at night when I'm on a plane, so I was getting ready to work, and the gentleman next to me asked me, what I was working on and where I was coming from. And I asked him, well, what are you, where are you coming from? And he said, well, I'm coming from Sudan, which really caught my ears because for about 2.5 years, I'd been trying to get into Sudan and I could not get a visa. And this gentleman said, hey, look, I think I could get you into Sudan. And he said, I work for an NGO, and we have projects in the Nuba Mountains. And we fly in on private planes or our organization's plane. And we land up there. There's no airport. There's no customs. All you do is you get off and you walk into the town. I said, whoa, that is fantastic. So I followed up and actually ended up catching a flight in to the Nuba Mountains. And that really changed things for me in regard to both the scholarly work on the ground, the interviews, as well as humanitarian work. So when I was up there the first time, there was this huge commotion in the compound where I was staying. And so I went up and asked what was going on. And there were rumors going around that the government of Sudan had threatened the Nuba people and told the Nuba people that if they didn't calm down and they quit talking about wanting to pull out of Sudan to establish their own nation, that they would be facing the guns and the planes, jets of Sudan. And a good number of years later, that actually happened. In 2011, war broke out. Where my humanitarian work came into play, and this is just one of those things, where you're working in a place, living in a place, getting to know people, and I started hearing these stories. One from a doctor, the only surgeon, he's an American in the Nuba Mountains. He told me stories about young kids, and we're talking 4, 5, 6, 7, who were so hungry because food had been cut off from coming in to the Nuba Mountains by the government of Sudan, that these kids were climbing trees and going out on the smallest limbs trying to get the fruit. And a good number of them fell and broke their arms so badly that some of the arms had to be amputated. And, so obviously I started thinking about that, the whole food issue. And as I traveled about, it was obvious to me that food was a major problem, that trucks coming over from Kampala in Uganda were fearful of traveling through South Sudan because there was a vicious war going on there. So that cut out food. So the upshot was I got together with a group of guys who were working in Sudan, who I had met, and we decided that, hey, we have the wherewithal, we've got the time, we can raise the money. We need to start bringing in food. And so one team went in, I did not. It was during the rainy season, and I knew about the rainy season. I told them they shouldn't go because the rain is torrential and not even four-wheel vehicles can get through the mud and the water. And anyhow, they went in and they loaded up a huge truck, a gigantic truck with food, and got stuck in the mud within about 10 miles of going into to Sudan. But they ended up delivering the food, but it was a long haul. It was very, very difficult. So I volunteered to do the next load. And the first group insisted that they be accompanied by the rebel group they were fighting against Sudan. So perceived as the good guys, right? And they were very cooperative with outsiders. So they had the military traveling with them in their vehicles with their weapons and all of that. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to travel on my own, primarily because if I decided I wanted to go someplace, I didn't want somebody telling me that I can't go there. And if I heard about something, well, I wanted to head there. So I went up there, delivered the food. And along with the food, we brought in salt, sugar, which they said they wanted and needed. They said that they could not eat what they cook without salt or sugar because it tasted so badly. So we brought them that. And that was, I think the first time I did that during the food was like 2013. And I made 4 or 5 additional trips of just hauling in food. And I'd buy the food in South Sudan and then hire a vehicle, hire a driver, and away we would go. And sometimes we would make 2 trips where we would go way up into the Nuba. It'd be like between an 8 and 20-hour drive, and we'd drive back across the border into South Sudan, purchase more food, and go back up. And that's the only reason I was going up there at that point in time. I was not interviewing anybody, doing no scholarly work, simply getting the food in to the people. And so, yeah, I did that for a good number of years, and it was satisfying. It was successful. I met a lot of other people who were working up there who were working in different ways. Met a team that was putting in water pumps so that the people didn't have to walk miles and miles to a pond and carry the water back. And the people who were stuck doing that were the women and the girls, not the men. And, if you've ever carried a bucket of water, it's not easy at all. And so they were putting in, they call them water posts. And so I met a lot of people who were doing a lot of work like that. And ultimately, I heard about how many people had left the Nuba Mountains and left South Sudan because of the war, the fighting, and ended up in Uganda. And there were areas there, huge refugee camps, again, where food was scarce. I also found out that feminine hygiene products were scarce. And so I made 2 trips just delivering feminine hygiene products. Because the poor girls would go into schools and, have their period and have all sorts of problems, leave school, be embarrassed, not go back. So hopefully this is going to help them in, a number of different ways. Ultimately, I had some serious health problems. And one of the problems that I have is exacerbated by heat. And a number of those trips in the Nuba, well, one in particular, I think we were traveling probably 8 hours one day, and it was about 113. And the water, if I would freeze water when I was in the refugee camp, I found a freezer, and I would freeze water, so it was solid when I left to head up in the Nuba, and within hours, I mean few hours. The water was warm and then hot, and I could not drink it at all. So that caused a lot of problems. Anyhow, after COVID, I wanted to get back into the work that I was doing, but I knew I couldn't go back to Sudan. And so I decided, well, I need a place that's, cold. That's the only way that I could work, because I couldn't really exist in heat. And that's when I decided then to go into Ukraine. And over the past year, I've taken 2 trips up to Ukraine, one in March 2023 and the last one in January 2024.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. Our next program concludes our conversation with Dr. Samuel Totten, Professor Emeritus of Education at the University of Arkansas. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on Buzzsprout, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Casts, Player FM, and Deezer. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy at hreusa.org. That's KRISTI at hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Jessica Terbruggen, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.